So tonight, for the month of Tevet, we're going to look at a story of a Greek king who made a mark on the Jewish calendar. You could call this shiur the miracle and tragedy of translating the Torah into Greek. Okay, so it's a story about a Greek king, but not the Hanukkah story. That was last month. Instead, we're going to learn another story in Jewish history that involved a Greek king, which actually took place well before the Hanukkah story. And this one's a little different because whereas Hanukkah, as we know, is a celebration of our victory over the Greeks and their allies, tonight we're going to learn about a fast day, a sad day that relates to another interaction between a Greek king and his Jewish subjects. Okay, so you might be searching your memory. You're thinking, wait a second, what fast day are you talking about? I don't remember any fast day this year that had to do with a Greek king. Don't worry if you don't know about this fast. You may, but if you don't, it's a fast that has fallen out of practice. It's not one that is typically kept today. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to investigate the origins of a fast day that was once, I guess, more popular, what it commemorates, and we'll think a little bit about the fact that we don't practice that today anymore and what that means. But there's still, I think, from this story, some very good lessons that we can take away for our own times about this event that was once considered important enough for us to fast every year to commemorate it. Okay, so the practice that I'm talking about is a fast day that used to be on the 8th day of Tammuz. So in this month, generally we're focused on I'm sorry, 8th day of Tevet. What am I saying? 8th day of Tevet. In this month, typically, we are focused on the 10th of Tevet these days, right? Asara b'Tevet. And that, of course, commemorates the beginning of the siege of the Babylonians of Jerusalem that will ultimately, eventually lead to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. That the 10th is still kept, of course, but there was this fast day on the 8th. So let's go through some sources just to give us some background about this fast of the 8th of Tevet. So let me share screen and we'll go through some sources together. Okay, so let's start with the Shulchan Aruch. So this is where there's a long list of fast days, many of which actually are fast days that we don't typically keep these days. But it says, Elu hayamim shiru bahem tsarot lavotenu v'ra'ui lehitanot bahem. This is a list of days on which bad things happened to our ancestors, and they're worthy of fasting upon them. Okay, and then it's a long list. And if you look at this list, it includes, on the 1st of Nisan, the sons of Aharon died, and Miriam died, and Yeshua ben Nun died, and it's a whole, but Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan was martyred. It's a long list, okay, and we don't typically keep these days, as you know, but they're days that are tragic days, okay. And then you get down here. It says B'Shmona b'Tevet Nichteva HaTorah Yevanit Bimei Talmai HaMelech. On the 8th of Tevet, the Torah was written in Greek in the days of King Ptolemy. V'haya choshech ba'olam shlosha yamim. And the world was dark for 3 days. Okay. So where did Rav Yosef Karo, in writing the Shulchan Aruch, get this idea of a fast day on the 8th of Tevet? Note that this fast day is not mentioned in the Mishnah. It's not mentioned in the Gemara. We will see that the story of the translation of the Torah into Greek is of course found in the Gemara, but there's no mention of a fast day. If you fast forward the Torah, which is of course kind of a legal codification that's about 200 years older than the Shulchan Aruch, that the Torah already mentions a fast day on the 8th of Tevet, though he doesn't say anything about this darkness for 3 days aspect. He simply says, B'Shmona b'Tevet haya ma'aseh de Talmai HaMelech. On the 8th of Tevet, the story of King Ptolemy took place. The event of King Ptolemy took place. Kind of leaves you to know what that is. And also notable is that if you go kind of back to the major codification that precedes the Torah, the Rambam does not mention this fast day in the Mishnah Torah. And of course, today it's not common practice for us to fast on the 8th of Tevet in our times. So what is the origin of this fast day? It seems to be later than the Gemara, as I said, but earlier than the Rishonim. It actually seems to have arisen in the period of the Geonim, that's kind of sandwiched in the middle. And so, for example, the earliest source that we have that mentions this fast day is the Bahag, the Baal Halachot Gedolot, which is, of course, a great work from the period of the Geonim, let's say 8th century. And he writes, Bishmona b'Tevet nichteva haTorah Yevanit b'mei Tamai HaMelech. On the 8th of Tevet, the Torah was written in Greek in the days of King Ptolemy. Uva choshech leolam shlosha yamim, and the world was dark for 3 days. So that seems to be the source of the language that the the Shulchan Aruch winds up drawing on. Actually, let me stop sharing. And similarly, there's another source from the time of the Geonim, actually like a little addendum at the end of Megillat Ta'anit that has very, very similar language. On the 8th day, the Torah was written in Greek in the days of King Ptolemy, and it was dark for 3 days. So, okay, so this seems to have come to be practiced during the period of the Geonim. But why? Why was this a fast day? What is so sad about this day? That's what we're really going to try to dig into tonight. Okay, why does the story of the translation of the Torah into Greek during the reign of this Greek king Ptolemy, warrant a fast day? What was so bad about that, or what how should we think about that? So, okay, first let's start with a little historical context. So for people who enjoy history, let's ask, who is this King Ptolemy that commissioned the translation of the Torah into Greek? What time period are we even talking? So it turns out that there were many King Ptolemies. Okay, it's a little tricky. There's a whole dynasty of kings in Egypt named Ptolemy the First, Ptolemy the Second, et cetera, et cetera. And the original Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's generals. So during his life, Alexander the Great conquers this massive area, basically more or less the whole known world of his day. And after Alexander's death, that giant kingdom of his gets chopped up among his top 4 generals. Okay, he has 4 generals. Their names are Antigonus, Cassander, Seleucus, who we'll kind of meet later, and Ptolemy, the 4th general. And Ptolemy, after Alexander's kingdom is carved up, Ptolemy winds up having his kingdom, or his part of the kingdom, of the remains of the larger Alexander kingdom. Ptolemy controlled Egypt, which was a very rich part of the kingdom, and he established a dynasty there of basically Greek-speaking rulers. So you had a dynasty of Macedonian origin ruling over the Egyptians for almost 300 years. Basically, the Ptolemies continue to reign over Egypt until the Romans come in and conquer them. And so in that dynasty, the male rulers were called Ptolemy, and the female rulers were called Cleopatra. So that's kind of neat. So it's similar. There's more than one Cleopatra, right? There's a series of Cleopatras. And they were basically like, you could think of them almost like pharaohs, but they were Greek-speaking, a Macedonian elite ruling over the locals. Okay, so which Ptolemy are we talking about? Thankfully, there is a clue out there. Apparently, there's an ancient text called the Letter of Aristeas, which dates from the 3rd or 2nd centuries BCE, written in Greek. It is in the form of a letter of someone who is a member of the court of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who apparently lived in the mid-200s BCE. And the letter, among other things, mentions that the laws of the Jews, were translated into Greek at the request of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Okay, so let's assume for the moment that this letter of Aristeas gives us a good clue of when this was written, or sorry, when this event would have taken place. That would place it about 100 years before the Hanukkah story, closer actually to Alexander the Great's time than to the Hanukkah story. And it also means that if this is happening again, like in the mid 200s BC, that means that the Greeks have already been ruling over the Jews for generations before the Torah was ever translated into Greek in this case, because Ptolemy, the second is generations after Alexander. Okay. And also keep in mind, since we're talking about Greek kings, but they're really quite different, we're talking about Ptolemy, which means, again, from that group of rulers of Macedonian origin that rule over Egypt. But that's very different than the bad kings of the Hanukkah story, right? King Antiochus is king of the Seleucid Greek kingdom. That is another part of Alexander's kingdom from that Seleucus, his general, had ruled over. So anyways, the point is that even though it's kind of this is Greek, this is a Greek king, and that's a Greek king, they're actually quite different, right? This story of the translation of the Torah into Greek is under King Ptolemy, which is kind of one type of Greek kingdom, and the story of Hanukkah is under Antiochus, who is from the Seleucid Greeks, who actually eventually come to control the land of Israel by conquering the Ptolemaic Greeks under Antiochus III, that is, under the father of Antiochus IV, the bad guy in the Hanukkah story. So anyways, a bunch of history to kind of place where this is, a little bit of historic context, which will matter a little bit, okay? Okay, so what do our sources, have to say about this translation and why it was so tragic that the story came to be associated with a fast day? Turns out that we have a number of different sources in our tradition that tell the story of rabbis translating the Torah into Greek at the request of King Ptolemy. A number of different kind of Mamarei Chazal with some variations, though the core of the story is always the same, but sometimes the details might change a bit. And what's interesting is that when you look at the different ways that the story is told, some are actually more positive and others very negative. So we're going to actually need to go through a number of sources to try to figure out what's going on. And what we'll do is we'll start by looking at some sources that are on the more positive side, let's say, and then eventually we'll get to some of the sources that are on the more negative side. So, okay, so let's do that. Okay, so let's start with Masechet Megillah. So this whole conversation about the translation of the Torah into Greek in the days of King Ptolemy takes place in the first parak. There's the Mishnayot in the first parak get to a whole series of, we call them the Ein Bains. It's a section of the Mishnah that goes through a bunch of different things and says there's no difference between this and that other than. Okay, the only difference between these two things is X. So that says Ein Bain Sfarim Litfilin Mezuzot Ella Shasfarim Nichtavim Bechol Lashon. There's no difference between Sfarim, meaning basically holy written texts, kind of like a Sefer Torah, okay? So between scrolls, but, kind of holy scrolls, and Tefillin and Mezuzot. The only difference between those is that Sfarim, meaning holy books, or holy scrolls, can be written in any language. Tefillin and Mezuzot einan nichtavot ela be'ashurit. But when it comes to Tefillin and Mezuzot, those can only be written in Ktav Ashuri, basically the type of Hebrew writing that we're used to today. And then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Af bisfarim lo hitiru shichtavu ela Yavanit. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel limits the ruling above. It sounded like the first opinion is that scrolls, holy scrolls, can be written in any language, but Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says no, they can only be written in Greek. And the Gemara, when it kind of gets into this whole sugya of what can be written in what language, that's the place where it gets to the story of Maseh de Talmai Hamelach. Okay, so that's just the context of why is the Gemara even telling the story? It's because we're talking about writing holy books in different languages. Okay, so let's go through the way that the story is told in Masechet Megillah. It says, Maseh b'talmai hamelech, shekines shiv'im u'shnayim zkenim, v'chnisan b'shiv'im u'shnayim batim, v'lo gila lahem ama kinsan. So the story of Talmai HaMelech was that he gathered 72 elders and had them go into 72 different houses, and he didn't tell them why he'd brought them together. V'nichnas etzel kol echad ve'echad, ve'amar lahem, kitvu li Torat Moshe rabchem. So then the king went into each house, where each house just had one elder, Jewish elder in the house alone. He said to each of them, write for me the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Natana Kadosh Baruch Hu in Greek, okay? In Greek. Natana Kadosh Baruch Hu belev kol echad ve'echad eitza v'hiskimu kulam l'dat echad. And miraculously, God placed in the heart of each one of them so that they all wound up writing the same Greek text. Okay, this is the miracle of the translation of the Torah into Greek. And then the next section of the Gemara, which I, haven't given you in full, is that the Gemara then says that the translation into Greek, while miraculous, that all 72 of these rabbis came up with the same text. It does point out that in that text there are a bunch of anomalies. There are a bunch of translations that don't seem to be the literal translation of the Hebrew text, and it lists them out. It gives a whole bunch of different examples, but it's kind of like a double miracle. That the first miracle is that all of the rabbis came up with the same text, and then the second miracle is that not only was it the same text, but it even was the same set of anomalies, the same set of unusual translations. And these translations tend to be things that would keep you from maybe of having misunderstandings. Okay, and then the Gemara goes on to say, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Af Besfarim lo hitiru shichtavu ala Yavanit. We saw that. That's a quote from the Mishnah that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that you, even with holy scrolls, you should only be able to write them in Greek. Amar Rabbi Yavahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, we hold like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that holy scrolls can only be written, if not in Hebrew, the only language that they can be written in is Greek. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time at Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Why is that? What's the rationale? Amar Kra, because it says a pasuk early in the book of Breshit, Yaft Elokim leYefet v'yishkon be'ohalei Shem, which literally means Hashem, God will expand Yefet, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem. But the way that this is interpreted is Yefet is these are the children of Noah, okay? And Yefet is understood, the Torah basically tells us, is the ancestor of Yavan, of the Greeks, and Shem is the ancestor of, among other peoples, us, the Jewish people. And so this is interpreted to mean that basically that the words of Greek may rest within those of Shem. Again, meaning this is kind of like the explanation of why is it okay to translate the Torah into Greek, even to write holy scrolls in the Greek language, because even going back as far as the book of Breshit, we already know that there's something special about the Greeks. There's something special, Yaft Elokim leYefet v'yishkon be'ohalei Shem. There's something about Greek that fits well within our tradition, let's say. Okay? So that's the first relevant kind of background text. Let's go through this a little bit more. This idea of the interaction between the Greek language and the Torah. Okay, so there's a very interesting Yerushalmi where it says, "Amar Rabbi Yochanan the Beit Guvrin." This is a certain Rabbi Yochanan who lived in Beit Guvrin. Arba'al shanot na'im sheishtamesh bahem ha'olam. There are 4 languages that are great languages that the world should use them. Ve'eluhem. La'az lezemer. La'az literally means just foreign language, but it's interpreted kind of universally here to mean Greek. Okay, so Greek is a good language for song. Romi lekrav. Latin is good for war. Kind of makes sense. Like Roman were great warriors. Sursi le'elia. The Syriac language is good for elegies, sad, songs of mourning. Ivri ledibur. And Hebrew is good for speech. Yeshomrim af ashuri lichtav. And some say Assyrian is good for writing. Anyways, the point is, 4 great languages, among them is Greek. And then it says, Tani, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, af bisfarim lo yitiru shichtavu el yavanit. Again, kind of quoting our Mishnah. The Yerushalmi says, Badku matzu she'ena Torah yechola lehitargem kol tzorcha ela yavanit. That the rabbis did an investigation and they found that the only language that you could properly translate the Torah into was Greek. And then it tells a story. It says, Burgan yachad bidalahem aramit mitoch yavanit. In fact, the translation of the Torah into Greek was so good that if you then translated that Greek translation into Aramaic, you got a perfectly good translation in Aramaic. So that shows you how good the Greek translation was, that if you translated the Greek into Aramaic, you got an Aramaic translation that was just as good or really good as compared to just translating the Aramaic directly from the Hebrew. And then it goes on even further. It says, Tirgem Akilas Hager, HaTorah Lifnei Rabbi Eliezer, Belifnei Rabbi Yoshua. There was a certain convert who translated the Torah into Greek before these rabbis. Vekilsuoto, and they praised him, and they said, Yefefit mibnei Adam. You are the most beautiful of people, but this word Yefefit is playing off of Yefet, right? So basically, just to kind of repeat, basically the rabbis of the Yerushalmi tell us that Greek is a great language. It's actually particularly good for translating the Torah into, of all languages. And there are actual cases where that was done, and at least Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua said, great job, great translation. It's not what we're expecting, given that we wind up having a fast day to commemorate the translation of the Torah into Greek. But anyways, this is some relevant background. Okay, so let's just keep in mind now that we're thinking a little bit about Greek and our interactions with the Greeks, our first interactions with the Greeks. Keep in mind that the Greeks, the interactions between Jews and Greeks were not always necessarily the same. In different times, we could have had different levels of relationship, of interaction with the Greeks, sometimes better, sometimes worse, as we've had with so many different empires, okay? And so when you think back to the earliest interactions, the first meetings, let's say, of Greeks and Jews that we know about, the first ones that we have any sources that talk about is that when the Greeks get to the land of Israel, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. Persian Empire, of course, included the land of Israel. Remember, Achashverosh ruled over 127 lands, Mehodu ve'ad Kush. Okay, that includes the land of Israel under his rule. And of course, when and it was Koresh, right? The Persian king who allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel, which was part of his empire. Okay, Alexander comes and he conquers the Persians. So when Alexander the Great first rolled into town, the Jews certainly would have asked themselves, is this good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? Because after all, like I mentioned, Cyrus, we had been, until Alexander came in and conquered the lands that we lived in, until then, we had been living under the Persians. And Cyrus had done this wonderful thing for us, that he'd allowed the Jews to return to Yerushalayim and to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. So he's amazing. The Torah, I mean, the Tanakh itself praises him. It says that he was doing this as kind of the hand of God. Okay, so that's a very, very good Persian emperor. But on the other hand, the story of Megillat Esther and Mordechai and Haman makes clear that being a Jew in the Persian Empire wasn't always a great thing. So again, it kind of depends. In the different times, the same empire could be good or it could be terrible. Now, also keep in mind that in its heyday, the Persian Empire was the greatest empire in the world. When Alexander conquered them, it was almost like, there have been some historians who've even likened it to something akin to the barbarians destroying Rome, except in this case, Alexander is the barbarian. Well, that's not the way we tend to think of him, but anyways, he was the small fry, let's say, conquering a much, much more powerful and storied empire. So now you have this young Macedonian warrior named Alexander. He rolls in, and again, is this good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? That's what our ancestors would have wondered. And perhaps the most famous story in our sources that talk about the first interactions between Jews and Alexander is an amazing Agadata, which is found in Masechet Yoma, which tells us about just that, when Alexander first rolled into town. So I'm not going to go through it in all of its detail, but just the big picture, the Gemara tells the story that when Alexander first came to town, the Samaritans tried to turn him against the Jews, and the Jews were afraid that this was going to work. Okay, that the Samaritans would basically convince the Greeks that we, the Jews, were bad, and that the Greeks should be against us. Specifically, that Alexander the Great should be against us. And so Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, who was the Kohen Gadol, puts on the clothes of the Kohen Gadol, and he marches out in order to meet Alexander the Great. Okay, this is the story as told in this Agadata. And then amazingly, when Alexander sees this Kohen Gadol, Shimon HaTzadik, approaching him, it says, Kevan shira'a li Shimon HaTzadik, yarad mimerchavto, v'ishtachave lefanav. Alexander got off his horse and he bowed down in front of Shimon HaTzadik. Amru, melech gadol kamotecha, v'ishtachave liyehudi zeh. They said, Alexander, what are you doing bowing down to this Jewish guy? Amar lahem, demut diokno shel zeh, menatzechet lefanai beveit milchamti. Basically, he says, before I go out to battle, I have a vision of this Jewish guy. And when I have a vision of him, I win my battles. Okay? So anyways, it's a super interesting Agadata that can be understood in various levels of depth. But if anything, it seems to imply that the earliest interactions with Alexander are remembered in some way as not having been negative. And also keep in mind that this Shimon HaTzadik, okay, we know of him. You might be thinking, he is the first person. He is the first person named in Pirkei Avot after all the generations of rabbis of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the elders who have no name. Okay, so just to remind ourselves, just we all kind of have this in the back of our head, but just so we're thinking about it together. Pirkei Avot begins kind of the earliest history of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That Moshe receives the Torah at Har Sinai, he gives it to Yoshua, who gives it to the elders, who gives it to the prophets, who give it to the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. And then the second Mishnah says, Shimon HaTzadik Hayam Misharei Knesset Hagdola. Shimon HaTzadik was basically of the last of the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. And then amazingly, this is the Shimon HaTzadik who lived during the period where the Greeks roll into town. And then amazingly, the next Mishnah begins, Antignos ish Socho Kibel Mishimon HaTzadik. The speaker of the next Mishnah has a Greek name. So clearly, something major is going on during this period. Something major is going on at a time when the land of Israel is shifting from Persian rule to Greek rule. It's a time of change. And so anyways, perhaps it's just a coincidence that this is the time where the period of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah ends and we enter into the period where we get rabbinic leaders, each of which have names and quoted opinions. Perhaps that is a coincidence or perhaps not. In any case, the bottom line is that the advent of Greece's conquest of the land of Israel was not necessarily immediately problematic for Jews. It may have led to some changes, but in other ways, at least we know that you have this period of the flowering of the period of the Tanaim that more or less will flow. You know, these are the rabbis of Pirkei Avot and of the Mishnah. These are the rabbis that we trace ourselves to, and they kind of come into the world by name during this period. Okay. Now, also, just if we keep going down this path, also relevant for thinking about the story, it seems clear that the rabbis that Ptolemy calls to write down the Torah in Greek spoke Greek, right? Of course, the story doesn't make any sense unless they themselves spoke Greek. And you would say, of course, when you think about it, this isn't surprising that the rabbis spoke Greek. We know that there were rabbis of the Mishnah who had Greek names. We saw Antignos ish Socho, but some other leading Tanaim of the period of the Mishnah had Greek names. So, for example, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Dostai, Rabbi Dosa. These aren't Hebrew names. These are Greek names that some rabbis had. And there are plenty of Greek words that are part of our kind of Talmudic lexicon, okay? Androgynous, apotropos, Sanhedrin, afikomen, prosbul. Okay, there are many Greek words that are part of our halachic language, okay? And there's even a line attributed to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the Gemara in Bava Kama, where Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says, in the land of Israel, why speak Syriac? Why speak Sursi? He says, either speak Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, or speak Greek. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is saying, there's only two languages worth speaking. Either speak Hebrew, or if you're going to speak a foreign language, speak the most important Gentile language, speak Greek. Okay, and there's a Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim, which is amazing. It says that there were, so this is talking about machatzita shekel, right? Basically, people coming and giving their half shekel to the Beit HaMikdash. It says that there were three, let's say, baskets into which people would put the money that they would contribute. The katuv bahem aleph bet gimel. Okay, there are three of these three baskets. And on it, it said Aleph Bet Gimel. But then Rabbi Yishmael Omer Yevani Katuv Bahem. No, it didn't say Aleph Bet Gimel. Rather, it said Alpha, Beta, Gamma. Okay? So this is also just something you don't expect. That perhaps, at least according to one opinion, the collection boxes of the Beit HaMikdash themselves had the letters Alpha, Beta, and Gamma on them. Bottom line is that it's clear that Greek language was part of everyday life at this time. People spoke it, rabbis used Greek terms in halachic discussions. Some rabbis had Greek names, and there doesn't seem to be any issue with translation into Greek per se. As we saw, maybe Greek is even an especially good language to translate the Torah into. Okay, and the Rambam, interestingly, in his formulation of explaining that Greek was one of the common languages of the day, right? He says, this is where he talks about this story of the translation of the Torah into Greek. First of all, he says, why was Greek different from other languages? Why is it treated differently? Because it was known to them. It was a popular language, a language that they understood. And he goes on to say that Yavan letalmai hamelech. The niparsema etzlam, and the Torah was translated into Greek, and maybe the Rambam says perhaps that even is part of what made the Greek language more popular, which is an interesting take. You would have thought perhaps, I think what he's saying, I think the message here is that the translation for Greek wasn't for Jews, but for somebody else. But maybe that facilitated even more Greek speaking among us. And then he goes on to say, and even further, that the Greek language was considered an exalted language for them at this time. Okay? So, what's interesting also here is that Rambam, who I mentioned before, does not mention the fast day of the 8th of Tevet, which is, of course, at the end of the day, what we're talking about. He seems to have this, like, his discussion of the translation doesn't seem to focus on its negativeness, but rather its almost naturalness that there would have been a Greek translation of the Torah. So that's kind of, I guess those go together. Okay, so let's kind of transition a little bit. So far, everything seems pretty good about translating the Torah into Greek for all the reasons that we've talked about. So, but we know that this is a negative story, right? Or at least is understood at some point to be a negative story. So what's even so negative a story that it becomes a fast day? So what's that about? So now let's go through a whole bunch of other sources, and we'll see that that there is a theme or a number of themes that for a number of different reasons, even if the Torah could be in theory translated into Greek without it being a bad thing, something about this particular translation, maybe the translation itself, or perhaps the circumstances surrounding it in the days of King Ptolemy, made it bad. Okay, so now let's go through a bunch of sources about the badness of this translation. Okay, so let's start with Masechet Sofer. These are all these minor chapters, minor tractates, not really kind of part of the Mishnah itself, but collections of statements of time, basically. Okay, so it says, Maaseh חמישה זקנים שכתבו לתלמי המלך את התורה היוונית, והיה היום קשה לישראל כיום שנעשה העגל. A certain story of 5 elders who wrote for King Ptolemy the Torah in Greek, and it was a bad day for Israel, as bad as the day of the making of the Egel HaZahav. Really bad day. Why? Shelo hayta Torah yechola litargem kol tzarcha. Because the Torah could not be properly translated. Though we did see elsewhere that specifically the Torah could be properly translated into Greek, at least in theory. But anyways, this source says that it couldn't be, or maybe was not properly translated into Greek. Okay, and this language of it being like as bad a day as the day of the making of the Egel is super interesting, right? It seems that clearly the idea is something got lost in translation, which is easy for us to understand. We know that anytime you translate something, something does get lost, right? Think about all of the concepts that if you try to translate like tum'ah into impurity just isn't a very good word for the concept of tum'ah, or like charity is not a great translation of tzedakah, repentance and tshuva. Anyways, we know of so many terms that don't translate super well. So we get that. And also we kind of have in the back of our heads that idea from the Gemara and Megillah that this translation had all these anomalies. It had all of these strange, unexpected translations that made it not quite perfect. Because we have that in the back of our minds. So this is the story of 5 elders translating the Torah into Greek. Then it goes on with another story. Shuv Ma'aseh Talmai Hamelach. Another story from the days of King Ptolemy. Shekanas 72, right? Shivim v'shtayim zkenim v'hoshivem b'shiv'a v'shnayim batim. That he collected 72 elders and put them in 72 houses, didn't tell them what they were going to do, and then the same thing happens as what we saw in the Gemara in Megillah, that they miraculously all come up with the same translation. And here, again, it says 13 different translation anomalies were found there, and it rattles them off. Okay. Actually, this is interesting. The Gemara Megillah only had 8 anomalies. This one talks about 13 anomalies. So again, the story is told over and over. They're not always exactly the same, but directionally, you get the sense that it's telling the same thing. Though here, clearly, this is a negative story. This is about the translation being not a good translation, as bad a day as the day of the Egel. Okay, here's another example. Masechet Sefer Torah, another one of these minor tractates. It says, Shiv'im zkenim kadvu Torah letalmai hamelech ktiva Yevanit, that there were 70 elders. This idea of the Greek translation the Greek translation of Tanakh was called the Septuagint, the translation of the 70. So we've seen so far 72 elders as the translators, but here we get the translation of the 70 kind of matches this version of the story, that there were 70 elders who wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy in Greek. V'haya oto hayom kashel Yisrael kayom she'asu et ha'egel. Again, same language. Shelo hayta Torah yechola letargem kol tzorcha, because the translation was not good. It was inadequate. And then it goes through all of these inadequacies or unusual translations once again. Okay. Okay. So let's pause there. What is this language of? Let's just think about this negative description of the translation of the Torah in the days of Ptolemy Hamelech. Why so ominous? Why so bad? So we saw this line, Shelo hayta Torah yechola letargem kol tzorcha. The translation was imprecise, it was inadequate, and we all know that bad translations lead to bad ideas about what the text means. And that actually helps us understand what it might mean when it says that the day was so bad, like the day of the making of the golden calf. What's the connection between the golden calf and this translation? Okay, so the reason would seem to be that the translation became like an egel for them, a go-between. What was the Egel HaZahav at the end of the day? The people who made the Egel HaZahav, or that danced around it, said, Ela Elokecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel, meaning that they were still worshiping Hashem, but worshiping it through the medium, let's say, of the Egel HaZahav. The same thing happens in the days of Yerovam ben Nevat. He puts up these, actually he places golden calves in his kingdom, and he invites people to go there to pray to Hashem instead of the Beit HaMikdash. The Egel is a go-between. It's a medium between us and between kind of mistaken people who are trying to reach the true God, but they do it through the Egel, which is a poor medium. So too with a poor translation. Okay, people who try to approach, it seems, the meaning is, who try to approach the biblical text, the Torah, the Tanakh, the Torah, but do it through this translation in Greek, would become confused, and it would be just as much a mistake. It would be just as much a mistake to approach the real Torah through this translation as it would be to approach Hashem through an Egel. Okay, so what's that about? What might stand behind that idea? So, okay, another historical note. For one particular group of people, the Greek translation of the Bible was the main way that they approached the biblical text. And here, what I'm referring to is the Christians. For the Christians, their main connection to the biblical text winds up being through the Septuagint. This is hundreds of years after the story of the translation of the Torah in the days of Ptolemy, but certainly by the time of the writing of the Mishnah, and even more so by the time of the writing of the Gemara, or many of the sources that will wind up in the Gemara. Christians are now a big factor. So it's possible that Chazal may have looked back at the evils of this Greek translation, or of Greek translations in general, in light of the fact that the Greek translation, the Septuagint, became like an egel. It wound up being a poor replacement for the original for a community of people who misread the scriptures and were led astray, like the generation who followed the egel instead of going direct to the original real source. Okay, this is one possibility, and it would help explain a little bit why so much importance is put in every telling the story on the errors in the text. Again, there's something about the translation kind of leads you astray. Okay, so that's one theory, let's say. What's the problem with the translation in the days of King Ptolemy? It's not the problem. It's not translation in general that's a problem. We saw that's not the case, into Greek at least. But maybe it was this was a misleading translation, even in its own time, or maybe a greater tragedy was that many years later, a particular group of people, let's just say the Christians, used the Greek version of the Bible to misinterpret the biblical text in tragic ways for the Jewish community. Okay, so that would help explain why this became such a sad day. Okay, maybe that's the tragedy. But there are other possibilities. Maybe the issue wasn't with translation per se. We saw that into Greek. And maybe it wasn't, something that happened much later, like the rise of Christians who relied on the Greek translation. Maybe the problem with this translation was the circumstances of the translation itself. Meaning, maybe the problem here was not the translation, but the fact that we had it imposed on us by a foreign king. And what you notice over and over when it talks about the tragedy of the translation is that it keeps telling us that it was the translation, we mourn the translation in the days of King Ptolemy. Remember in the Shulchan Aruch, he says, on the 8th of Tevet, the Torah was written in Greek, Bimei Talmai HaMelech. Similarly in the Torah said on the 8th of Tevet is the fast. Why? Hayamasa de Talmai HaMelech. The story, the happening of Talmai HaMelech happened. Similarly in the Bahag. Similarly in all of these sources, the focus is not, it never says that we mourn because the Torah was translated into Greek. It always says that we have this fast day because the Torah was translated into Greek in the days of Talmai HaMelech. And then you start thinking, well, think about how weird the story is. He takes 70 or 72 elders. He puts them in separate houses. He doesn't tell them what's going on. He is imposing on them that they have to do this. You start to hear in the background that maybe this was a form of persecution. This was a situation where the foreign power required us to translate the Torah for their purposes, which might have worked against us, and that kind of shmad, that persecution is the issue, not the translation itself, but maybe the circumstances of that translation imposed on us by King Ptolemy, and that's why he's always mentioned. Okay, so we saw that, I'm going to keep going through possibilities. But the first possibility we saw that maybe the problem was the translation and the way it was used ultimately. Second, maybe it was the problem of the circumstances of the translation being imposed on us by outsiders, by a foreign king. A third possibility, and this will be the last one that we go through. Maybe our negative view of the Greek translation of the Torah emerged later during another period where there was a negative view of Greekness and of Hellenism. Maybe that happened towards the latter or during the period of the Hashmonaim, right? The Hashmonaim, as we know, are the Maccabim arise to fight against the influence of Greekness. And there's a very interesting Gemara in Bava Kama. This will be the last source that I'll put up, and then we'll really hopefully bring it all together. But there's a Gemara in Bava Kama that basically says, it starts like this: Ein magdilin chazirin bechol makom. You're not allowed to raise pigs. Okay, why can't we raise pigs? So it tells a story that during the civil war that took place in the last generation of the Hasmonean monarchy, that you had these two brothers, two Hasmonean brothers that are fighting against each other, and one is actually besieging the other one. Okay, and it's basically a civil war that's going on. And then it says, Hayasham zaken echad shaya makir bechochmat Yavanit. There was a certain elder who was knowledgeable in the wisdom, in Greek wisdom. And he basically, this guy who is an elder on the one hand, okay, he is a zaken, so it seems that he's kind of in the fold. But on the other hand, he's got one foot on the outside. He's knowledgeable in the ways of Greek. He basically gives the advice that if you want to really like get the Jews in trouble, what you should do is then each day when we normally would give them the animal that they would use as a sacrifice, let's today give them a pig. And that will set them up for failure. Okay, without going through the details of that, it's the fact that he is 1 foot on the inside, he is a zaken, and 1 foot on the outside, a person who is knowledgeable in Greek wisdom, and he winds up kind of betraying his own people. Therefore, be'otasha amru arur ha'ish shigadel chazirim. At that time, they said, "Cursed is the man who raises pigs. The arur ha'adam shilamed beno chochmat Yavani. Cursed is the person who teaches his son Greek wisdom." The operative thing here is be'otasha, meaning that there was a time when maybe it would have been considered acceptable to teach your child Greek wisdom, but certainly it came to be seen, at least at the time of this extreme Hellenization during the last days of the Hasmonean Empire, that Greekness was a problem. And we really see this, as we know, that the Hashmonaim themselves become Hellenized. The Hashmonaim, the ones who are the heroes of the Hanukkah story for fighting off Hellenization, and the Greeks themselves, only a few generations later, have become corrupted and Hellenized. Okay, so maybe this later view of the dangers of Hellenization are part of what made later generations look back at the translation of the Torah into Greek and say that was a tragedy. That is something that we need to mourn and fast for. Maybe in the earlier days, it had been thought that Greek was a great language and that maybe translations into Greek, at least in theory, were not a problem. Maybe even in practice, we saw an example where the rabbis commended a great translation into Greek. But later on, as history played out, there certainly came a time, perhaps during the Hasmonean period, when some Jews changed their view and determined it to be too dangerous to learn the Greek language and to get too close to Greekness in general. And so maybe, again, through that lens, the translation of the Torah into Greek was seen to be a very negative thing. Okay, let's try to bring it together. Let's recap, because we've covered a lot of ground. We saw that there doesn't seem to be an issue with translating the Torah into Greek per se. So if there was a fast day to commemorate the translation of the Torah into Greek, it's not because the Torah ought not, under any circumstances, be translated into Greek. In fact, we've seen statements of Chazal that make it sound like Greek is a particularly good language to translate the Torah into. And we saw that the rabbis of the Mishnah spoke Greek, some had Greek names. In some places, they specifically praise Greek as a wonderful, elevated language. And some sources about the origins of even this first translation of the Torah into Greek make it sound like it might not have been a tragic event at all. It was a miraculous thing. Just like our first interactions with Greece were not necessarily all bad, as what we saw from the story of Shimon HaTzadik. Perhaps at first, it's not obvious why the translation of the Torah into Greek would give rise to a fast day. But as we dig deeper, we see that there might be more to this particular story of translation. Maybe there was something problematic about this particular translation. Maybe it was just a bad translation. We saw language in Masechet Sofrim, that talks about that it could not be translated properly. There's something about the translation that was lacking. And we saw over and over kind of pointing out that there are these unusualness of the translation. So there was something just not quite literal about it. And maybe that was a fault. Okay, that possibly was just a bad translation. possibly the problem was that people came later and used it in a bad way, used it like an egel, like a medium, rather than looking to the real thing. Maybe related to the fact that Christians later wound up using the Septuagint, as they did, as their primary source of Tanakh. Okay, or maybe the problem was that it was imposed upon us by an outside king. Maybe this is a story of Shemad, of a foreign king imposing upon us, opposing his demands upon our religion. Okay, or maybe there was a broader reassessment over time about the dangers of Greekness and Hellenization, perhaps after Hanukkah, during the period of the Hashmonaim, when they themselves and the Jewish people at the time in general became more Hellenized. And we look back and we saw that the translation of the Torah into the Greek was somehow, maybe a part of that story. Okay, bottom line, there's no single source that we have that says conclusively why the 8th of Tevet became a fast day. We've seen a host of reasons that may be contributory, right? And maybe it's a combination of these, of how it came to be that the 8th of Tevet wound up being a fast day commemorating the translation of the Torah into Greek in the days of King Ptolemy. Okay, and bottom line, Lamaisa, we actually don't celebrate the fast today. But that said, we should still take something away from this. Okay, that we don't fast this way today, and again, there are a number of reasons why our kind of ancestors fasted at some point for it. But there is a message to be taken from it, I think, today, which is that, as I started in the beginning, this is the month where we have the fast of the 10th of Tevet. Okay, that's 2 days later. And that is usually, we think of that as being the fast day that commemorates the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. And there are hints that what's happened is that the fast of the 8th has kind of been swallowed up or subsumed under the fast of the 10th. So the origins, there's still reason to fast for the 8th, but it's kind of all been wrapped up in the 10th. And one way that you see that is that there are actually some keynote of the 10th of Tevet, which mention the story of the translation of the Torah into Greek. So it's almost like the 10th has swallowed up the fast of the 9th. Okay, what would that mean? What would that mean for us to still kind of have the 8th in mind, even as we fast on the 10th? So I think the idea could be this. Asara B'Tevet is a fast day where we mourn the siege of Jerusalem. And this is an idea that I tried to develop actually in last year's Tevet shiur. We could think of Asara B'Tevet as a fast day that commemorates more than just the siege of Jerusalem under the Babylonians back, in the around 586 BC. Okay, of course, that is what Asara B'Tevet commemorates, the siege by the Babylonians. But maybe it commemorates something broader. Maybe Asara B'Tevet forces us to think about the tragedy of Jews living under siege more broadly. Not just that siege, and not just physical siege, but maybe a broader type of siege that we have lived under in many times in many places, a spiritual siege. Maybe the siege of Hellenization. Maybe the siege of Christian domination. In each generation, there are different forms of spiritual siege that we've lived under. Many examples of basically being under siege as a minority in a much larger and more powerful outside culture. That actually is a kind of siege that I think we can relate to more easily today. It's something worth keeping in mind when we get to the 10th, and including the way that it swallows up the fast of the 8th. That sometimes there's no army waiting outside the walls, but sometimes we do feel like we're encircled and endangered. And maybe that is the backstory of the translation of the Torah into Greek, which we've seen in different angles on it, but they all kind of share the same theme at the end of the day, okay? That perhaps the translation of Torah to Greek, which at first may not have even been viewed as negative, came over time to be regarded as one brick, kind of one part of the story of a spiritual siege that Jews wound up living under. And that is something to take seriously and to be concerned about in our day as well. Okay, so I'll leave it with that. Everyone should have an easy fast at the end of the week, and hopefully some things to think about. Thanks everyone for joining.